Hi, I'm Jim White from the Southwest Church of Christ. Welcome to today's class as we study another lesson. This is lesson number 9 in our series on outrageous claims in the Bible. This one may be a little uncomfortable for some people. It's one of those kind of things that we hesitate to talk about. It's on the topic of sex. To some, it may be of great interest. As we talk about this, there are going to be a lot of statistics, a lot of different data that's been researched and found, and so it may seem boring in some cases, but I think it's very important that we look at these things. The world looks at sex a whole lot different than the Christian should. It looks at sex a whole lot different than God does. And so I think it's important that we look at this. Now, I want to tell you something, and I don't do this at all to brag. I do have an undergraduate degree in biology or zoology, and I taught school for a year. And I taught biology courses to junior high kids, and so I'm not afraid to talk about this. It's kind of hard to teach junior high kids about this, but I think it's important that we talk to not only those of that age, but also those of us who are older. I'm not ashamed about it. God created sex. And the problem comes is when it is abused and used outside of the parameters that God has set up. But it's interesting as we look back on our history, per se. If you look back on the 1950s, and the 60s is when things really started to change. But some would have called it kind of a Victorian attitude or prudish. But it's interesting to see how things have evolved over the years. Not too long ago, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback, his name was Russell Wilson, he and his fiance were going to get married, and they announced to the world that they were not going to have premarital sex. They weren't going to have sex until they got married. And I remember the response to that was just unbelievable. There were a number of people who just, they just ranted about how silly that was, and they were just astounded by that. They were highly ridiculed, and they were just incredulous. And then recently, and by recently I mean in the last month or two, Patrick Mahomes, who's the quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, he and his fiance had a reveal party because she's pregnant. And everybody was excited about that. You heard me right. I said fiance. They've been living together for quite some time. They're not married. She's pregnant. She's expecting. And everyone was excited about that. I remember when the old Dick Van Dyke shows, that kind of ages me a little bit, but when they showed a scene of Dick Van Dyke and his name wasn't Van Dyke in the television show, I don't believe, but when he and Mary Tyler Moore, who played husband and wife, when they showed a scene in their bedroom, they slept in separate beds. And so that was the kind of the way that society looked on those kind of things. They were very careful about not showing those. Now, well, there's little left to the imagination, and things have changed. All you have to do is turn on the television, and you'll see all kinds of things. Soap operas are just unbelievable. It used to be only in the movies. You could go if you went to a movie, you'd go to a movie and you'd see all kinds of sexual innuendos and things like that. But now it's very open. It's very open on television and wherever we look, even in video games. It's crazy how open it is. And we see it in our politicians, and we see it in our athletes, and it's, you're considered unreasonable, a prude, or any other kind of name if you take any other kind attitude towards this. And so it's important that we look at this. Books are being written. I remember reading a book called Bridges of Madison County. And it was a book, it won several awards. They've made a movie out of it, about a middle-aged housewife who lived on a farm. Her husband didn't treat her very well, and a photographer from National Geographic, I believe it was, came into town to shoot some pictures, and they ended up having an affair. In the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which is a cute movie. We got a lot of laughs out of it, but the two main characters went to bed before they married. And studies show that over 90% of sexual encounters on television and movies are between unmarried people. That stat is from 2005. That was 15 years ago, and I'm sure that it's higher now. If you seem to get upset about pregnancy anymore outside of marriage, if it happens, there's one of two things: either an abortion is done, or everybody's excited about it. Few talk about sexually transmitted diseases or anything like that. It's always interesting to me that the media kind of glosses over things like that. I remember a few years ago I was teaching at a youth retreat, and the topic that was given to me was the church as Cheers. Now, some of you remember the story about Cheers, or the television sitcom Cheers. It was set in a bar, and it was a funny show, and everybody in the bar, it was very bright. People didn't tend to get drunk on that. And yet, the very thing about bars they're a lot different than what you see on television. It's the same thing with sex and sexual innuendos. Nobody really wants to talk about the consequences of what happens outside of marriage, and yet it is very prominent. I saw a show that this couple was together, and she was kind of talking to him, and she would say to him, "You see that guy over there? We kind of once had a thing." And he said, "Oh, yeah, okay." And she said, "And that guy over there, we kind of had an affair." She doesn't say that, but she said, "We had a thing." And his response is very interesting. He says, "Well, that's okay. That was before I met you." And that's kind of the way we react to that. And it's kind of interesting. And once again, you're considered old-fashioned, out of touch, if you have these morals that are outside of this context. And when someone does get pregnant with, life goes on. And I've already mentioned some have abortions. Even commercials are full of sexual innuendos. I was just thinking about some of the commercials that were on TV right now, and there's a commercial that this old couple says, "We do it every night." Another couple, "Yeah, we do it every night." One girl says, "I'm single, but I still do it every night." And what it's advertising is a dishwashing liquid, and yet that's what they use to promote their product. There's another one when Grandma and Grandpa are in the closet, and they come out, they're trying to reach something, they come out, their clothes are wrinkled, and their grandson comes up and sees them, and of course he's thinking, I know what they're doing in there. And it's a commercial about some kind of fabric softener or wrinkle remover. And that's kind of the way things work. They'll use sexual innuendo in order to get or to sell a product. There's a very common saying in advertising, and that's sex sells. What kind of effect does this have over us? What kind of effect does this have on our kids, on our teenagers? A vast majority, websites are pornographic. It's very scary to think about the websites that are pornographic. And you can do things like this in your own home, in the quiet and the privacy of your own home. And one of the things that I thought of was, if you want to see what's going on in our government or in our White House, it says, you can go to a website, whitehouse.gov, G-O-V. Well, the pornographers, the ones that work in pornography, saw an opportunity. And so they came up with a pornographic website called whitehouse.com. Just 3 simple letters that are different, and yet you find yourself on a pornographic website without really knowing that you're doing that. And as a minister, I'm finding that pornography is becoming a huge problem in marriages. The husband is addicted to pornography, and the wife feels like that it's almost like adultery, that I'm not good enough for him. And I've just seen many situations like that. And as I said, television has a huge, huge influence. Not too long ago, I'll give you an example. Not too long ago, I had the grandkids with me, and we were going to go eat at Arby's. And as we were pulling into Arby's, my grandson says, "Arby's, we have the meats." And so if you don't think that kids are hearing that, then you know something's off with you. I was reading another one that talked about the mother asking the son about what time he wanted to eat, I think it said. And he says, "I want to eat at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock Central." And so, you know, it's kind of interesting how those things go. And I know I've been hard on the men at this point. I've been talking about pornography in men. But we don't want to leave the women out. Because there was a study done in 1994. This is 16 years ago. And it said that nearly half of American men and 1 of 6 American women bought erotic materials the previous year. 1 in 6. And so it's just crazy what we're seeing in our society today. But doesn't it make sense to try out a relationship before you commit to another person for a lifetime? That's the philosophy of the world. Shouldn't you test it out? If you're going to go and buy a car, $20,000, $30,000 car, don't you think you would take that on a test drive? Wouldn't the spouse way more important? Well, what do we say to that? Sex is more than skin on skin. God has always known about this, and He knows what's best about sex. And it's interesting because God created sex. You see, true intimacy is found within the boundaries of morality that God set out for us. God's wisdom really works. And I know when things are done the way that God wants them to be done, the world will say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I can't believe you, and you're so prudish." But they work. People are more happy. They're more satisfied. And before we get into some of the statistics on this, we'll find that God's way works. Christians, you're just, this is what the world says, you're just suppressed and old-fashioned and Victorian. And I have to admit, it's probably been Christians who have painted sex as dirty and evil. But God designed it for husbands and wives to bond and recreate and enjoy sex together. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in 16, this is from the Message. It says, "There's more to sex than mere skin on skin. Sex is as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. As written in Scripture, the two become one. And since we want to become spiritually one with the Master, we must not pursue the kind of sex that avoids commitment and intimacy, leaving us more lonely than ever. The kind of sex that can never become one." Isn't it interesting that the Bible even talks about this? That it talks about how intimacy is one of the most important things to a husband and a wife. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I'm going to have to look this one up. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5, we find these words. And the entire chapter of Corinthians here, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, is on marriage. But chapter 7 and verse 5 says this: "I say this as a concession, not as a command." Now let me go up a little bit. Verse 5, "Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Now it's interesting, in the Bible there's a lot of talk about, I would rather that you remain single as I am. But he says it's better to marry than it is to burn with passion. And so God approves of sex within the boundaries of marriage. True intimacy is found, as I said, within these boundaries. God's wisdom really works. And as we go through this, it's interesting to know that God is going to be diametrically opposed to what Hollywood says. There are consequences that come with sex outside the marriage. This next part may be a little, tedious in some ways, because we are going to talk about a lot of statistics. And I could have gone on and on and on all day long, considering the studies that have been done, the research that has been done, the different things that have come up. But I didn't want to bore you. I wanted you to see, and many of these studies are fairly old studies. And I imagine things have not really changed that much. In fact, if they've done anything, they've probably gotten worse. Sexually transmitted diseases are on the rise. Scientists report that they're at epidemic levels. Now, if you have an epidemic of something, you're going to get really, really concerned about it. But we don't seem to be too concerned about these sexually transmitted diseases. It's just something that we accept as something that just happens. We don't ever talk about that. Cervical cancer is being spread by unfaithful husbands. AIDS and HIV have become just unbelievable. And I know there's been some medications and things, and there's been basketball stars that have come down with HIV that are still alive. But in Africa, for instance, it is a huge, huge problem. 1/3 of a billion cases of sexually transmitted cases have shown up around the world. 1/3 of a billion. 5 million in 2003, 5 million people contracted AIDS. 5 million. We haven't even talked about unwanted pregnancies. I almost, I wanted to tell you a story, but I better not. I'm sorry to do that to you. If you want to come to me and want to know what the story is, I'll tell you the story. But abortions, I could go on and on with statistics about abortions. Abortions have become commonplace. In fact, with the latest approval of the judge on the Supreme Court of the United States, abortion has been brought up again. It's a hot button issue. But one of the things that I continue to think about are the effects. I know they have effects on the man and woman who are involved in these kind of things, but I think about the kids. I think about the teenagers and the consequences with them. I remember when I went to elementary school, nearly everybody there had two parents. My daughter is a teacher in a public school, and she says very, very few have both parents, and when they are, it's a blended marriage of some kind. In fact, what happens a lot of times in these mixed marriages and things like that, and I'm not trying to I got to be careful. I don't want to generalize things and say, well, this is the way all of them are. But more abuse comes in these marriages. My daughter told me a story the other day. They have computers at their school. Because of the COVID, they have given all the children laptop computers. And she said that this one child has now broken 2 computer screens. And she said the only problem was the second time that it was broken by the father throwing it across the room. Well, what can you expect? We don't tend to follow God's guidelines. There are spiritual prices that are paid when we don't follow God's ways. It affects us spiritually. It tends to make us further away from God and not closer to God. And then we have what's called visual adultery. You remember Jimmy Carter? Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States many years ago. And he made a comment one time. He said, I have committed adultery in my heart. And of course, he was referring to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, the early part of Matthew. He was ridiculed. To this day, people still talk about that. And yet it's very true. Many commit visual adultery. In Philippians chapter 4, this time in verse 8, Paul says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Man, you look through that list. True, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy. Those are the things we should think about. And yet the world continues to shove into our faces these scenes of illicit sex and everything else. And I barely touched on pornography. I read a thing that said 70% of pornography ends up in the hands of children. 70%. And if that's a problem with you, I beg you, get help. Get help. There are a lot of people who are wanting and willing to help you with that. Well, let's talk a little bit about trial marriages. Let's just try this out for a while. Let's live together and see what happens. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Right now, and I can't give you the latest statistics, but I can get pretty doggone close. Over 50% of all marriages end in divorce. Isn't that crazy? Half. Every wedding that occurs, half of them will end up being divorced. That's just in regular situations. But statistics show that those who live together are twice as likely to get divorced after they do marry. The more premarital sex you have, the less happy in your future marriage, and the more likely that you or your spouse will cheat on you. Studies have shown that. While couples often think that premarital sex will strengthen their eventual sex life when they're married, research shows that the exact opposite is true. Married couples are less likely to have a satisfactory sex life if they live together first. That doesn't make sense, does it, in some ways? And yet, it is contrary to what God tells us to do. Women are far more likely to be abused if they have lived with a man before they were married. I think this was in the 1990s. 3,432 Americans were interviewed by researchers at the University of Chicago. And here are some of their conclusions. Married couples reported being the most physically pleased and emotionally satisfied. Married couples. The lowest rates of satisfaction were among single men and women, the very ones presumed to having the most sex. The groups having the most sex is not the young and footloose, but the married. And so everything that the world keeps throwing at us is completely contrary to what God continues to tell us. Physical and emotional satisfaction is delivered when people had more than one sex partner. Or it declined, I'm sorry. Let me read that again. Physical and emotional satisfaction declined when people had more than one sex partner. Now, before we end this, I want to just talk a little bit about I don't want us to get to the point where we point fingers. We need to continue to remember grace and mercy. To remember the comment, but there for the grace of God go I. We need to remember that there is forgiveness. We need to remember there is grace. We need to remember there is mercy. And I don't want to stand here and say, every one of you who have done any of these things, number one, you're going to get a sexually transmitted disease. Number two, you're going to have complete and emotional dissatisfaction. I'm just telling you what the statistics say. But I'm also telling you that God's way is always right. And you say, well, Jim, what about the divorces that go on? I would imagine it's because they haven't done things God's way. That there's selfishness, that there's pride, that instead of coming together, they have continually driven wedges and gone apart. There's a passage of Scripture that I read at a lot of weddings, and it's found in Ecclesiastes. And it's an interesting passage because it talks about, and I know a lot of people say, well, this is about friendship, and more than likely it is. But I want you to listen to what this really says about marriage. It's found in Ecclesiastes. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. No, that's not it. I'll just have to quote it for you. I should have looked it up, and I apologize. But it says, two are better than one. When one falls down, the other helps them up. When two lie down together, they keep each other warm. And it says, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And what I refer to in a marriage, in a wedding ceremony, is it's interesting that there are 3 strands. The first strand is the bride. The second strand is the groom. And the third strand is God. And when you put those 3 together, when everybody is committed to what God wants in their marriage, then it's amazing how successful it is. It's amazing the intimacy that occurs. It's amazing the closeness that happens. And that's what I'm praying for you today, is to realize if you're in one of these relationships, you need to understand you need to do it God's way, because God's way is always best. I hope you have a good day.